So on this, the 99th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, we welcome Maurice O'Callaghan to Macroom and now invite him to come forward to give the oration.
According to Galer, go to Mila Mahagad Pat as Octon Quida, a God Shiv Dom con Tafton Chogadi on Balias Darul Orsa Shaw Macroom con Oroid Shaw Hort con Comora and the Cosca a Yanov. Among my most vivid memories are the RTE programs celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. This was in 1966. It was called Insurrection, or Shock Their Far, Shock Law, and it held the country's attention for an entire week. It was narrated in dramatic fashion by a great actor called Ray McAnally, and it was constructed in such a way as if the action were taking place before our eyes like a documentary or a newsreel. It had wonderful music composed by Sean O'Riordan, who did the symphony Misha Era, and the country celebrated with gusto. There was no question of doubt or shame associated with it, and the nation felt good about its origins as if it were the natural and the right thing to do. A change came over the country during the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. We became sophisticated in our own minds. We began to make money and we began to look outward, and in some circles it became fashionable to go back and to look at the events of 1916 and to question their very authenticity. In other words, these revisionist rewriters of history suggested that there could have been another way to achieve independence, such as by home rule. Now this trend has increased, and you have such commentators as John Bruton, Owen Harris and Kevin Myers today deploring the fact that we should commemorate the centenary at all, much less celebrate it. They say we'll send the wrong message, that we'll offend our British neighbours. They say we should invite British royalty and turn the event into some kind of a backslapping carnival so as to encourage tourists to visit and say what a wonderful and obedient little country we are. Good Europeans, top of the class with Angela Merkel, goody two-shoes to our new masters in the European Union. But these revisionists take no account of the history of this benighted land. They try to ascribe the political and social mores of today to a time 100 years ago when things were totally different. They are rewriting history to suit their own agendas and to exclude certain present-day parties, such as Sinn Féin, from power by attempting to cast doubt on their bona fides, by suggesting the country will go to a hell in a handbasket if they are elected. In other words, they're indulging in blatant scaremongering to frighten people and keep them in their place. This happened before. It happened during the years of the Great Famine from 1846 to 1850. This was, without doubt, the greatest tragedy ever to befall Ireland. Our population reduced by half, millions died of starvation, scarlet fever and cholera. 2.5 million people emigrated. We conveniently forget that the British economic policy of laissez-faire allowed this to happen. The market should prevail. The fittest should survive. The poor should be kept in their place and the big landlords allowed to expand their holdings by clearing the tenants off the land. 20 ships a week might export grain and cattle to England, while one ship might bring desperately needed yellow meal to feed the starving in Skibbereen, in Ballydehob, in Kilmichael and in Macroom. The horrors of the famine led directly to the rebellion of 1916, but not immediately. It took a further 66 years. During those intervening years, the Young Irelanders were formed, and then the Fenians, then Michael Davitt and the Land League. Pearse read the great oration at the grave of O'Donovan Rossa, and then he and his companions wrote the proclamation of 1916. The Irish people were no longer fooled. They knew that the interests of Ireland would never be served by a foreign empire. They knew they could not be trusted and that British self-interest would always trump the interests of Ireland. They promised home rule and then revoked it on more than one occasion. Today, John Bruton, in his blinkered righteousness, says home rule would have come eventually. But who is he to say this 100 years later? It's all very well to say that a plebiscite was recently allowed for Scottish independence, but would this have been allowed by Asquith, by Lord George, by the Tories and the Whigs of the time? Would a plebiscite to allow Irish independence have been sanctioned in 1916? It is impossible to imagine it occurring because it was impossible, and no amount of wishful thinking will make it otherwise. Today, our country is recovering from the effects of a savage recession. Austerity, cutbacks, and unemployment have devastated the lives of many. While banks and bondholders have been rescued, people have lost their homes to the sheriff at the door, so that bailed out banks can be repaid. And those banks charging interest rates of 4 and 5 and 6% today, while the ECB rate is almost at zero. This is called price gouging. This is called extortion. Thousands have emigrated. Families' lives have been blighted like the blight of Black 47. Successive parties have failed the people, much like the people were failed in the famine. Is it any wonder that people are seeking alternatives and hope through such parties as Sinn Féin and the Independents, who will at least stand up to the outside forces that again threaten the sovereignty of Ireland? Elites will thrive as they have always done. Europe is a cosy cartel for Euro MPs and commissioners and former commissioners and for top politicians. For the wealthy, all is well. But not so for the poor. Just look what's happening in Greece. They're being told to toe the line, accept austerity, liquidise and privatise their best assets. This is also being asked of us here. Irish Water being an example. Do not be surprised if that becomes a private company owned by some billionaire mogul to generate maximum profit. Already, Dennis O'Brien controls one of the companies installing the water meters. It does not require a great leap of the imagination to see how Irish Water could become a cash cow for the likes of him a few years down the line. I grew up in a house where we were proud to be freedom fighters, where my father and my uncles and my mother's people fought in some of the great battles of the War of Independence. They had no choice but to defend their families and their homes from marauding black and tans, who were sent to crush the revolution begun in 1916. They were young men and women, poorly armed, poorly trained, but with courage in their hearts and a heroic vision. Those present-day pseudo-intellectuals and writers are not worthy of being mentioned in the same breath. They are not fit to lace their shoes. Without 1916, there would have been no election of 1918 when Sinn Féin won a huge majority. There would have been no War of Independence. These events captured my imagination, and many years later I wrote about them in some of my stories and films. I became aware that the stories and history of my own people and my own place were just as valid and just as important as those from anywhere else. I believe to understand the present, you have to understand the past. And this is why history is taught in all major colleges and universities around the world. The Trojan War is still one of the most written about and studied events in world history, although it happened 3,000 years ago. The Americans continually make films and write books about their war of independence. They write about Valley Forge. They write about Gettysburg. The British, always assured of the righteousness of their cause, have toiled as a warlike nation that grew into an empire that bestrode the world, celebrating at all times their military achievements, erecting monuments to Nelson, to Montgomery, to Oliver Cromwell, eulogizing the warrior, apologizing to no country for their prowess. So why not we? 1916 was a rebellion of poets and dreamers and philosophers. They knew their cause was doomed, but by their dying, they changed the outlook of the people. As the great poet Yeats writes in his poem, Connolly and Pearse, MacDonagh and McBride, now and in time to come, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Yeats was no lover of Irish republicanism. He was essentially an Anglo-Irish loyalist with romantic notions of a Celtic twilight. Yet he recognized the supreme sacrifice made by the men of 1916. He knew and recognized that without that sacrifice, we would always be a nation of serfs, beaten, starved as we were in the famine, and wiped out. The deaths of the men of 1916 changed everything. Their deaths created a terrible beauty, both in the mindset of the people, in art, in literature, in politics. This kind of self-sacrifice is extraordinarily powerful. Any visit to the small courtyard of Kilmainham jail to see where these men were shot standing up against a wall leaves a lasting and a haunting impression. Their sacrifice is not in vain, and a nation recognizes this no matter the attempts of a present-day timid government to make us think otherwise. So let us go forward, with heads raised high. Let us look all comers in the eye, for we are the indomitable Irishry, with a great history and a great culture. Let us celebrate the fountainhead, the source of our nationhood, which is 1916. And let us guard it and preserve it, no matter what wind will blow. Gurumila Mahadum Galer.